Welcome Kelly Lannan. Kelly has almost, did you know, Kelly, almost 13 years of experience at Fidelity Investments. She's been in a number of positions, including the Vice President of Young Investors. She's now managing a branch as a branch leader for the flagship branch for Fidelity in Boston. She has an MBA from Babson. She's got an undergrad from Union. She is a mother of two, and she's also a fellow hockey player, might I add. So I am very excited to talk to you. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yes, I'm so excited about that. And the only thing you forgot to add in is that Lindsay and I have been friends and we met in a leadership development program at work. And this is just the best thing to be reunited. So not only am I all those things, but I could not be more excited to take part in this conversation.
Exactly. The most important is a friend. And actually, it was really through that program and the amazing training that I experienced was the catalyst for launching Plum Leadership Group. The amazing programs that I'd been through with you, with that amazing cohort, it's really stuck with me and something that I've been trying to replicate. They have the gold, Fidelity as the gold standard of training, in my
No,
opinion.
I mean, I'm not surprised at all. It's so funny for everyone listening. When Lindsay and I reunited, we still have a group chat for those who are still at Fidelity Investments. And I pinged and said, oh, and I just took a screenshot and I was like, oh my gosh, team, like, look who I was reunited with. And then, of course, they're asking all about you, Lindsay. And I shared a little bit what you're doing. And no one was surprised. Everyone was like, of course, that's what she's doing, because that's just who you are and who you were to all of us. And I think, like, trust, I'm not the only one who would say we so value everything you taught us when we were going through this together. So I'm so happy that you are where you are in this part of your career. It's awesome. It's really exciting.
Thank you so much, Kelly. So we're going to talk today about generations and expectations, the future of leadership. And I thought you were a great person to talk to about this topic, Kelly, because of your experience both with young investors as the VP of Young Investors and now in a branch position where you're dealing with staff from multi-generations, staff from different levels and backgrounds, and also your clients, right? Your clients are also very multi-generational. So I'm excited to talk to you about this topic. I always want to level set, and I'm not sure if you have different definitions of different generations, but just so we can level set different generations, do you have any definitions that you like to use when we talk about Gen Z or Gen Y or young and
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it is interesting, depending on where you look. And even everyone listening to this, depending on like your latest Google search, you might see slight tweaks in this, but the generations that we really focus on, mostly because they are the primary generations within the workforce, are baby boomers, which is typically someone who is ages like 60 to about 80. And the boomers represent, and I'm going to speak from a US perspective, represent about 25% of the US workforce, roughly. So we have our baby boomers, and then we move to Gen X. And Gen X is around 44 years old to about 60, and they represent about 33% of the workforce. And then we have the millennials, which I fit into. So maybe you'll hear me talk a little bit more of millennials than anything else, just because obviously you know what you are and you can speak to it sometimes more often. And that is anyone from 28 to 43 years old, and that's about 35% of the workforce are represented by millennials. And then we have Gen Z, so that is age 12 to 27. And that's about 5% of the workforce. So those are primarily the generations that, in our work and in our research, is in candidly the ones you see more often in the workforce today. But then you have like Gen Alpha, like my two kids, 3 and 4, they're Gen Alpha. Wonderful. They'll be here soon enough, and we'll talk about them. Yeah. Kind of the silent generation, right, above the boomers. And we're not dismissing them. In fact, I think about 5% of the workforce is still part of that silent generation. But Lindsay, for the sake of this conversation, as well as what we're primarily focused on, what we're paying attention, is really those 4 buckets. And obviously, like any generation, they have some defining traits, which I'm sure we'll get into. And, what I always find very interesting is it is so often the events in one's life like put generations aside. Like Lindsay, I'm sure you and I can recall specific events in our life that really helped define us. And it's so often looking at, baby boomers, right? The civil and women's rights, like the moon landing, Gen X, Berlin War falling down, Gulf War, first phones, millennials, 9/11. I remember exactly where I was when that happened, the rise of social media. And then we have Gen Z, where like they've never even known a time without everything I just mentioned. And COVID was such a big part of their life. I mean, all of our lives. But anyway, so I'm sure we'll touch upon that a bit. But that's what, when we're thinking about those different generations, we got those 4 buckets as well as focusing on the events that have shaped them. So.
And the buckets will shift, right? Our
Right.
conversation right now, that's the percentage and the breakdown. But as the boomers retire and as the new generations join the workforce, we're going to have to adjust yet
Yeah.
again. So we might have another episode in a couple years.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think like, and I don't know these stats as accurately, maybe you do, Lindsay, or people listening, but I think if you like zoom out on just like humans in the world, I do believe that a combination of Gen Z and Gen Alpha, more in those 2 generations than every other one combined out there in the world. So like exactly to your point is the rise of these generations and the other generations get older, we'll definitely see some really clear shifts. So.
In your experience, Kelly, moving from young investors,
Mhm.
then moving into being a branch leader, what were some of the changes or the differences that you noticed right away?
Yeah, so why don't I quickly share a little bit about the why? Because Lindsay, I even think when we were first talking, you're like, what is this? And I have to say, just in my own community here at Fidelity, when I shared with people I was taking this leap, because it is in fact a bit of a leap, people were like, wait, what are you doing now? So that was all things exciting, but then like terrifying because the reaction people gave me, I was like, oh geez, what have I done? Just so everyone out there knows, and Lindsay, you probably remember this. When I started at Fidelity, I was part of the same program as Lindsay's leadership development program. And there's really where I recognize that Fidelity is a company that could help younger people. And for the life of me, I didn't understand like why we weren't shouting that from like the roof more than we were. I wish I had known that before I started at Fidelity when I first started joining the workforce. Maybe we'll get into some of those regrets later. Um, and it was at that moment, and I often joke, what the heck was I saying in my interview? Because I actually didn't realize how cool this company was until I started here. But it was at that moment that I became so passionate about helping younger people with their finances. And because I was now in a company that could do that, the passion of mine, where I was just kind of helping off the side of my desk while we were going through our leadership development program, it ended up becoming a job. Where my focus was, to start, Kaylee, speaking about the generations, was really focused on the millennial. Everyone was about the millennials at this time. It's millennials this, millennials that, you millennials this, you, and because I was one, I often had people saying you millennials to me. But it was all about the youngest of millennials. And at that time, it was those in college, right? And it was really about financial education and how it is so lacking in school curriculums across the country. Could Fidelity help fill that gap? And then from there, the role evolved, the role grew, it kept getting bigger. Going after our next generation of customers ended up becoming one of our top enterprise priorities. And so this was a role that I ended up staying in for almost 10 years. And I loved it. I love it. Let me change my terminology. Everything about it. It's still something that fuels me. I'm still super passionate about. But like hopefully anyone who motivates and is eager to like do what's next. I don't know, Lindsay, if you've ever felt this way, like I realize like I need to do something else. Like I need to do something else. I need to challenge myself. I had plenty of problems in that. I needed some new problems to solve. And furthermore, when you have the same individual leading something for so long, like even from a firm perspective, like you need new perspective. And so I recognize this. And so as a result, the start of last year, it was like, what's next? And now this opportunity is something that came to me. And it is interesting to one of your previous points when you open. I'm going from our next generation of customers are younger investors. And trust me, we have plenty of clients who fill kind of in that quote unquote younger bucket. But now a lot of my clientele leans more towards the Gen X and the baby boomers. And they do happen to be individuals who might have accumulated more assets than the younger individuals simply because they are older, right? I mean, think about it. People don't even reach their peak accumulation years until your 40s plus. So I am now going after a very different clientele. And something else you said, which really struck, I now lead an investor center, over 40 individuals. And I have individuals who are newly out of college. I have individuals who've been here in this exact investor center for 25 to 30 years, who are older and only have maybe a couple years to retirement, and everything in between, right? So you have the clients that you care about more than anything. Our whole mantra is helping more people, but then also have a group of individuals from all different generations who have all different needs, all different backgrounds. And I think like the magic is really managing both of those. So I just wanted to provide a little context around, why I made the switch, why it truly is very different. And then can get into a little bit about just what I've noticed about, how the different generations, what their defining traits are, core values, and all of that. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to take a step back too. And I know we've defined generations, and we're going to talk on one hand, it's helpful to have a definition and bucket it, but there are going to be anomalies when we say
of course.
in general, this is how we might communicate or work differently, that we're speaking in generalities to help people understand the concept, but not to put people in a box or stereotype.
Of course, yeah.
So
And on that note, like what you
yeah,
also might all have heard before is that sometimes individuals who kind of straddle the generations a little bit, like there's this woman who I follow on Instagram and social media. She's focused on the Zillennials, those who are both in Gen Z and the millennials. I have friends even, who've told me maybe they identify more with Gen Xers than millennials, or vice versa. So it is very interesting because, yeah, where you're born and the events that shaped you are only a piece of the puzzle. So I think that's a really important caveat, Lindsay, to mention.
absolutely. So what would you say, Kelly, from your experience, how do the different generations work and communicate in general?
Yeah. So in some ways, there's obviously similarities, but I think we'll focus probably a little bit more on some of the differences. So we could start with the boomers. And when I think about some of the traits that really define them, their values, hard work, really driven into teamwork, optimistic. Mentorship is super important to that generation. I have quite a few mentors actually here at Fidelity who, would identify in the baby boomer generation. Some of the core values, again, we touched upon hard work, loyalty. You have individuals at Fidelity who've been here 30, 40 years, and obviously most are in that boomer generation, the baby boomer generation. And then when I think of communication, you have the boomers on one end of the spectrum, where email, but in person, it is super important. And it's funny, like sometimes, like you ask the question how they like to communicate. I feel like sometimes that, people are like, well, why do you insist on having phone calls versus just texting, right? We'll get to Gen X in a second, but I just feel like that's how, the baby boomer generation and others, trust me, they're the individuals who believe like that's actually how we build trust, is communicating it voice to voice, versus maybe Gen Z would be like, no, I know plenty via text. So again, like I feel like sometimes there's misconceptions, and maybe we'll get to that at one point, but that's really when I think about the boomers, the baby boomers. Even saying boomers, sometimes I'm so attuned to like, what's that, like, okay, boomer, like, so I don't mean that at
Yeah.
all, right? Going to that as well, but like, anyway, so that's when I think of the baby boomers. And then when we think of, Gen X, the 44 to 68 category, ability, independence, this group is very strong communicators, very self-sufficient. They're individuals who really value the autonomy, that balance in life. If you think about where they are, often this is also referred to as the Sanders generation, right? This is a generation, this is a group of individuals, because where they are in life is that they're not only balancing and sometimes juggling, I would use that word, their children, but also their older parents, right? And so that's where that balance, that need for work-life balance, I think really does come in. I think compared to maybe the millennials and even the baby boomers, they're often more pragmatic, typically than some other generations. And again, similar to the baby boomers, I think far more often skew in the workplace towards email, maybe team or messaging via the internet. But again, that's what we've noticed with Gen X. And then we'll move on to the millennials, right? My people, if you will, a little bit more tech savvy, collaborative, socially conscious. I think this is really a group that is looking for feedback, wants more responsibility in the workplace. Not quite where Gen X is, but they want to be, right? And they want to be viewed as that. I think also this is a generation, as I was telling you, Lindsay, like all those millennials, I think this is a generation for a while was like defined in comparison with like avocado on toast. So as a result, I think that's like really gotten to them as like the lazy generation, which I really don't think is true. And so some of the core values is all around like purpose, growth, like continuous learning. And in terms of communicating, we definitely, messaging, email, but then we start to get more in like being more okay with texting, right? And the short-term communication. And then of course we get to Gen Z. We mentioned the previous generation, things like cell phones and the first personal computer and things were a first. But like, if we think about it, Gen Z, if you think about their ages, right, 12 to 20, they never have been part of a world or remember a world without the cell phone. They've never been part of a world without social media, which, you could argue like there's a lot to that, right? But like there are digital natives, entrepreneurial, embracing diversity, care a lot about mental health and want to make sure that they're working with and for a company that also values that. Being authentic, getting recognition is all part of what they care about. And unlike maybe picking up a phone call or, even email, this is a group that texting, short text, visuals is really where their communication style comes in. And so that's a lot, right? That's like how a little bit about how they like to work, how they like to communicate, some differences, some similarities, but you can only imagine like working in an environment where you kind of hit upon all those, right?
All of them.
Yeah.
And I would say a lot of the clients that I work with, or a lot of managers, leaders that I work with, who are probably in, either Gen X or millennial, some boomers too. A lot of their comments are, how do I talk to Gen Z?
Yeah.
How do I communicate with them? Because it is so different. Like you said, we tend to connect more with those who are our similar generation. We get them. We've experienced the same experiences that they have. From your experience or your advice, how would other generations connect with it? I'm not sure if you've heard the Gen Z stare.
Yeah. Yes. Heard it, seen it. Yeah. All the things. So I know, and sometimes they're words that are used, right? Riz, I can't even say it. Like, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Do your kids talk like that, Lindsay?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah. So, or like, it's so fun. So again, my 3 and 4-year-old, and we went to this Boston Pops is a that I'm sure maybe you've been to the Pops, Lindsay. I know your family in this area, and it was holiday Pops, and Santa Claus like visited Pops, and Santa gets on stage, and the conductor of the Pops was saying something and asked Santa a question, and Santa gets up and he goes, I don't know, 6, 7, and like everyone knew what that was, and I've had my 4-year-old come back. I'm like, what are you all talking about? So anyways, yes, sometimes a different language, but so let's actually let's work with Gen Z, right? Again, I've had countless managers when I first started at Fidelity. What I always say, you millennials, right? I think they're sometimes misinterpreted as entitled or soft, like those who are always on their phone. But in reality, these are also individuals where maybe their expectations are a little bit different in the sense that digital natives, they don't have the patience if they can't figure out something within minutes because you can easily pick up your phone and go, versus others might not have been part of that, right? And in reality, like sometimes because like one can get an answer so quickly, they're very clear on their boundaries, right? They're clear on their boundaries. They're eager to fix something that can't give them an answer in minutes, and they like to be inclusive, fast learners. So I think that sometimes we have to take like the things that are misunderstood and take it, well, what does this actually mean? And so when I think about how to lead individuals who are in Gen Z specific, and again, this is just, just some thoughts, nothing steadfast. And Lindsay, as I was telling you earlier, again, I'm not a generational expert. I know what I know because of how I work. And also I've had the opportunity, especially in my old role, to speak to many generational experts, and they've given, some thoughts on here as well. But I think that explaining the why, and not just giving the what, I think is super powerful for this generation. Candidly, one could argue that's how one should always lead, candidly. But I think going that extra step and explaining the why we're asking people to do a certain thing, I think goes a very long way. Love feedback, right? Giving feedback early, often, and being very clear and specific. And that goes back to the why. Why am I giving you this feedback? Giving very clear examples. I think letting them question and being okay with the way we're doing things, especially if it's something that you've been doing for years and years. Having someone with a fresh perspective come into the workforce is awesome. That's why we love interns. We have so many interns who come here every summer, and they're awesome. And they always ask me, like, well, what's one of your jobs is to tell us how we can be doing things better. You have the fresh perspective. You can come with ideas and thoughts that we can't even dream of, even individuals who are a couple years out. So it's wonderful. So I think letting and embracing younger people, Gen Z, asking questions on the why is super powerful. Like, if you think about it, that concept of a reverse mentor is very prevalent in the workplace. Like, a lot of individuals, baby boomers, Gen X, are looking for someone who's a little bit younger to provide that perspective, and that should continue. I think also flexibility is interesting, and this could be a hot topic, right? Especially post-COVID and trying to get people to return back into the workforce. But I think in offering flexibility in how they work, I think is important. But it just goes back to like creating boundaries for them. This is a generation that likes to be clear on boundaries. So yes, you can be more flexible in the hours you work. You just have to get the work done. And if the work isn't getting done, then we have to go back with, being, a little bit unflexible. So I think those are some ways, Lindsay, especially with, our next generation, that I found helpful in how I lead, at least. I'm sure there's many more, but that's kind of what I think about, So one last thing, and I think this goes with millennials too. The other thing I've noticed is a lot of our younger investors, because how we define young at Fidelity is those who are 35 and under, which is actually both millennials and Gen Z. So we have two generations in that. It's just making sure it's very clear. And this is more from a workplace perspective, although I know, and I feel this way, you want to work with, you want to buy from companies that align to your values or purpose. That's also huge. Making sure, and that goes back to the why. If the why isn't aligning to their values, purpose, maybe it's okay for a bit, but chances are they might end up leaving that workplace sooner than later because they don't feel that connection.
I love that. So aligning values, managing to expectations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of work hours, that feels key. And the other piece is the why. I think there was the misconception maybe, or the misalignment, is that boomers and X, we often, right, just did what we were told and didn't ask the why. Why do I have to? Because I told you so. Versus that those younger generations need and want the why. And that's so helpful in, if we're thinking about change management, if we're thinking about any kind of way to get the best out of someone, it's for them to understand the why. They're able to participate so much more.
And I think, like, on the flip side, right, let's talk about, let's break down some of those misconceptions around, I brought up Gen Z likes to ask questions about how outdated. Well, on the flip side, I think sometimes a misconception with the baby boomers and even Gen X is that they're resistant to change. I don't think that's it. I think what comes into play here is that they're not necessarily asking questions because they don't want to change, but because, unlike Gen Z, who may be new, they've seen things break before. They've seen things and they haven't worked out, or they've seen fads, things come and go, and it just didn't work, and they want to stick to what's worked. So I think it's also working on both sides as well. Now, listen, just because this is how it works, managers tend to be a little bit older in those older generations, obviously Gen Z younger, but I think it has to work both ways. And I think that's where I've seen the most successful relationships, is that those who are in older generations understand those misconceptions, and that's how they're leading. But conversely, some of the strongest leaders who might be Gen Z millennials, they're also doing their best to understand misconceptions of the older generations, tapping into experience of others, allowing tradition to stand, but also making sure, like, they're pushing against innovation. inviting others to coach them and asking for coaching, leading with respect, some of the things that we've already talked about. I think that is where the magic happens between teams, where it's not just like one generation catering to another and understanding how to lead, but the vice versa. And I've worked with plenty of people who are just fresh out of college and otherwise who seem to really understand that, which is kind of cool to see. So.
And so now you, in your current role, Kelly, you are managing, like you said, 40 associates, probably from multi-generation. So how do you as a leader manage that team with different generations without feeling like a category? Manage you this way or you this way. How do you reconcile that? How do you lead from
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is, and I'm also reflecting a little bit on not only everything you just said, but being a new leader, right? Coming into a world, Lindsay, where people in the investor center environment, this is all they've known. So some individuals here, they've only worked in investor centers. And here I am, somebody who's never stepped foot in a branch and now is the boss, right? And so I think step one, and this goes candidly with my opinion, step one in any new role, whether you know nothing about the role or whether you know everything about the role, but you have a new team, I think at the heart of everything is building trust, right? Like I think that's where it always has to start, and that's where I really leaned into. And so I think a few things, regardless of generation, regardless of everything we've already talked about for the first bit of this conversation, I think you always have to start with the human versus the work. And so I really truly made it a priority to set up 30-minute meetings with every single individual in the investor center. And I don't even think we talked about their career once, maybe here and there, because, right, like a reality of all of our lives is that career and life blend together. Even when you try to keep them apart, they so often don't. But those first conversations was all about the person in front of me, about their family, about what drove them, what they cared about, what inspired them, what they wanted to be when they grew up. I mean, all of that as like step one to really, building trust. And I think a lot of that, and this is an important leadership quality, in my opinion, is that constant curiosity, the constantly asking questions. I think that is just key. You always have to be curious, not just about like a process or something in the workplace, but about the person behind it, and not just like listening, but truly hearing, what someone in front of you is saying. So I think that was really step one in building trust. Just made it about the individual versus anything having to do with the workplace. And I think also, step two, it was also understanding how the teams operated and worked together. Understanding a little bit of what was driving not just the person, but like the complex dynamics of the investor center in general, and working to understand that and coach accordingly. But again, I think that was probably the most important thing, Lindsay, was building trust, learning about the individual in front of you, sharing a little bit about me right back, making sure it was very clear how I liked to lead and where I was going to lead, like leading with a culture of transparency. And once I got on that first page, it didn't matter if you were Gen X, a baby boomer, it doesn't matter. I think that's at the heart of starting a relationship with anyone. And that's kind of how I approached it. And that was like 6 months ago at this point. So.
And I love the idea of incorporating curiosity, Kelly, because whenever you're faced with a difference, someone is operating or doing something different, whether it has to do with their generation or not, if you can approach it with curiosity, with asking questions, you're going to come to a greater understanding. And most of the time, you do share the same values, you do share the same desired outcome. You might approach that situation potentially a little differently.
For sure. And I think it's also like how I love how the investor centers here, they always start with, which is very refreshing. They always start with the person. And they always start with, well, what inspires you? Once they get that, then they can align accordingly based upon what that individual shared. And what's also really nice about that is that it really helps set accountability, in my opinion, because it's not Kelly forcing an inspirational goal on Lindsay. It's saying, well, Lindsay, this is what you told me you wanted to achieve. We've aligned accordingly and you just haven't got there. So like, let's go back to it. So I really love the culture that developed in the investor center, because it always just starts with the associate first and goes from there, versus so many other parts of the organization, not just Fidelity, but elsewhere. It always starts with like the goal set upon by a leader, and that's what it aligns to, versus wait, let's start with the associate. Let's align to them, and then we bring the goals in, which I've definitely grown to appreciate. And what that also does is that it's not blanketing, these crazy statements on these different generations, which we've already called out, have different needs, different communities, etc. It's starting with the person, which also I think helps to combat against different generations in the workforce.
One of the fundamental parts of managing people is giving feedback.
Mm.
Have you noticed any generational differences in terms of feedback?
Yeah, I think how it's given. I mean, kind of going back to even our conversation on the why. I will say this. I think giving people the why behind the decisions or the feedback, from my opinion, I don't think that's necessarily a generational thing. I think that is just something that everyone needs to know. I think that in terms of the communication preferences, going back to some of the things that we spoke about, knowing that baby boomers prefer in-person conversations, in-person dialogue, is very important when giving feedback. You prioritize that, which candidly at time, like I personally, and this is a little bit about me, I would like in the moment feedback. I don't necessarily want, Lindsay, you to wait a week before you give me the feedback. However, if you're working with someone who in person is the preferred way of feedback, maybe you do have to wait a couple days to give that feedback because it'd be better to deliver it in person versus on Zoom or via email. That's just one example, right? I think most people really do prefer directly hearing about things as they're happening, especially the millennials and Gen Z. And so every time that I begin also new relationships with an individual, I ask them to fill out a little bit of like the personal user manual. And one of the questions is always like, how do you receive feedback? And I use that in my toolkit in order to give it to them, right? So that's something with feedback. But I think in terms of the generations, I think most people are actually very receptive to feedback. And I don't think it's a generation thing when people aren't. I think it tends to be a human thing. I've noticed more than
Yeah.
others. I
Yeah.
haven't necessarily noticed it's a generation thing, but I think how people handle the feedback is obviously the most important thing. You don't want the head nod. Okay, yeah, I heard you, but are they really hearing me and they're going to do something about it? So I feel like sometimes that's where the biggest differences come in.
Yeah. And it probably goes back to one of the foundational things you talked about with establishing your team is trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you have trust with your team members, regardless of their generation, trust from knowing that you have their back, that you have their best interest, feedback, whether it's in person or virtual or on the spot or in a performance review, is all coming out in a different way because you have that establishment of trust and of care.
Course, yeah. And that's why, again, starting with the associate and what they want out of their career and aligning your feedback to that, in some ways, it almost takes the onus on the manager. And what I mean by that, it's like, hey, I'm giving you this feedback because this is what you told me you wanted out of your career, not Kelly, but you, Lindsay. And I think that helps when giving someone feedback and maybe sharing and having those difficult conversations. I also think that, and I always say this to the team, like there are people and none of the feedback, nothing I'm ever going to share is never going to have anything to do with anything less than helping them. Like I'm giving it to them to help them be a better person. I was talking to one of a leader who I respect actually last week, and he shared something that his mentor said. It was like better that they respect you in a year than like you for a day, which I really appreciated to hear that because I just like had to have a very difficult conversation with someone where I told it to them straight. Which is, hey, this is where you stand and this is where you need to be. And maybe it wasn't the easiest thing to hear, but I know in my heart, Lindsay, and again, this is not a generation thing at all. I know in my heart that I was giving the feedback based upon what they told me they wanted to hear. And I know that there was respect there, even if it was hard to hear. Maybe they didn't like me in that moment. But I guarantee you, this time next year, the respect will still be there.
Well, Kelly, we're going to head on to my favorite round, the lightning round. I mean,
Like this too. I know you shared that you were going to do that. I was very excited for this.
because we want to get to know Kelly, the leader, a little bit more on a personal note. So I'm going to ask you some questions. The first thing that comes to mind, and these are things I'm always interested in habits. And I know it's especially topical, but what's one leadership habit that you never skip?
Oh, I like this. And we actually talked about this a little bit, asking questions, staying curious. And then I think, and I might have said this even before, then really trying to make sure that I'm not just listening to the answers given, that I'm actually truly hearing what others are saying. But the curiosity, asking questions is a leadership habit that never, ever, ever should be skipped.
Amazing. Love it. What's a piece of advice that you got early on in your career that still holds up? Maybe besides the one that you just shared.
Oh, focus on what you can control, period. Focus on what you can, and this is something that I will say constantly to my teams. Focus on what you can control. Now that's the piece of advice I first heard, and I will never give that up. And something change is so constant, not just at Fidelity, but I just think in life, candidly, in corporate America. The piece I've added on those since, because now I give this advice back. Focus on what you can control and kick the crap out of it. So that's like I added to that, but that is a piece of advice I got very, very early here. I don't even know if it was at Fidelity or where it was, but it's something that I will forever lean into. And kicking the crap out of what you can control, I think just makes that much sweeter.
In every aspect, Kelly,
Yeah.
not just work, but in every aspect.
Yeah.
The best manager you ever had, what made them great?
Oh my goodness. When you ask a question like this, it's so funny. I immediately have people who came to mind who were amazing. And then I have horrible managers. Like, what made them horrible? So maybe it's both sides of the coin. But, I think some of the best managers that I had, they got to know me. They built trust in me. They gave me more responsibility than maybe I could even take on. And they trusted I would get it done. They looked for opportunities to get me in front of senior leadership to increase my visibility. We're never a micromanager. I think the opposite. I'm trying to, there's something here. I'm like grabbing it right now because it's on my desk. I once put together this framework, which like was sharing a little bit about leadership. It's like 4 quadrant. It's a buddy, empowering leader, absentee landlord, and a micromanager, like all traits of leadership. And it's so funny, like to this day, like one of the worst leaders that I've ever worked for. This individual was both a absentee landlord and a micromanager, which was like the worst. It was someone who never leaned in until it was like hours before the meeting, and they would all of a sudden get into it and want to micromanage. So I gave you a little bit of what's made the best, which I always try to anchor on, and then some of the things that I do not appreciate as much in a leader.
Yeah, we often learn the most from that, from mistakes, from things
Yeah.
that we've seen wrong. Like often it
Oh
can
my
shape our
gosh.
leadership when we've seen or experienced something that is not great. It can form our leadership even more than the greatness. What is
Yeah, for sure.
a book or podcast, a resource, a TV show? What's inspiring you right now?
I maybe shouldn't admit this because I'm recording a podcast. I don't have a super long commute, which is candidly one of the reasons why my husband, who also works at Fidelity, we chose to just live in the city, and we literally our world is like within like a 2 mile radius. So I'm not super into podcasts, and I think that's a big reason why. But let me share a little bit of a twist to that. I recently at Fidelity, there's been this new initiative where it's a whole institutional knowledge program where the retelling stories of the past. Fidelity turns 80 this year. They're retelling stories of the past to senior leaders to make sure that we either don't make the same mistakes twice, we learn from these stories to do better. The latest story, which I was just watching actually last week, and Lindsay, I'm sure you remember her, Kathy Murphy,
Oh
who
yeah.
is the former head of retail at Fidelity, is in these videos. And oh my goodness, she is one of the most inspirational leaders, humans I've ever worked with, ever even looked at, experienced with, worked with in my entire life. And she's in these videos. And it just reminds me of a time when we had a powerful woman leader who was so smart, so kind, got the job done, executed flawlessly, and she's retelling this story. So again, a little spin to your question, but that is something that is inspiring me right now. And I think my husband will always remind me of this story. The first time I met him, again, he works here. I told him that I wanted to be Kathy Murphy when I grew up. And so to see her now in this videos, it's pretty inspiring. So a little twist to your question. I hope that's okay.
No, I love it. That's great. What is a leadership lesson that you've had to learn the hard way, Kelly?
It goes back, Lindsay, to something you just said before around sometimes it is when you don't have as strong as a leader or manager that you learn the most. And it goes back to just a hard year. I had semi recently when there were a lot of organizational changes. I think I had maybe 5 managers in a year. It was like you never really had an advocate, someone who had your back. And, Lindsay, I was always someone who truly believed you work hard, you execute, you get the job done, good things will happen. And for the most part, that is true. Trust me, that is true. But every once in a while, in the midst of significant organizational change, when someone doesn't necessarily have your back, and you don't have that control, things don't always work out for you. And so I think that my biggest learning is to make sure, even when I'm super totally content in a job, knowing that it's people, it's relationships that really make or break careers here, always to keep my lines of networking open, right? Even like now, I've been in a job 6 months. I love it. I'm not looking to move on anytime soon, but I've really still made it a priority to continue to build my bench of advocates across the entire company, just in case we go through some of those significant changes again, where I really feel like I don't have an advocate out there who has my back. So,
yeah. Or you want advice, best practice,
yeah.
hear a different perspective. Relationships are really at the core, and I think often forgotten, both from a career development, from a mental health, from a lot of the pillars of life. Building relationships across is often a lesson, yes, that we all can learn the hard way. Okay, I have to ask you another question. This might not technically be lightning round, so don't feel like you have to keep it short and succinct. But as a fellow hockey player, what have you learned from sport and work? How do you incorporate, or what lessons have you learned on the rank that you've taken into the boardroom?
Honestly, everything. No, it's so true. And I don't know if you feel this way, Lindsay. I feel like my time spent as an athlete on a team is beyond instrumental to everything that I have accomplished and am still hoping to accomplish in my career. The value of teamwork, the importance of hard work, the feeling that you get checked and you get pushed down, you have to get right back up again. Empathy, compassion for others, right? Like you see everyone in their best and sometimes having their hardest day, and then you got to come to the rink and wipe it all off and get the job done. I truly believe that being an athlete for me has shaped who I am in the professional environment. Like I don't know, I don't even know what the heck I would be like if it wasn't for the time spent on the rink with the team, with my friends, shared common goals, working hard. I mean, the list goes on, but I truly feel that way. I'm sorry, I don't mean to like sound over corny, but
No, I love it.
it's very true.
We could do a whole episode on just that.
Yeah, we could. Maybe our next one. If this is okay here, Liz, if you'll have me back again, that would be really nice. So,
well, I have one last question for you, Kelly.
sure.
If we were to go back to that hockey playing Kelly at Union, looking, out at her career, what advice would you have given to your younger self?
Oh my goodness. I would say invest in that 401k. Start investing early. Oh my gosh. I was I like knew nothing about money, but also graduating during the recession. I just came into the real world being very afraid of the stock market, not knowing how to manage my own money, but knowing that I didn't want to live with my parents, right? And I wanted to work hard, pay bills, but I still wanted to have fun on Friday nights. So I chose not to get started with investing until I was 28 and worked at Fidelity, almost 13 years ago. So anyways, that's what I would say. Maybe get started with investing, Kelly, a little bit earlier. But I'm in the game now, which is all that matters.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, made my day. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.